Imagine a city, the greatest on earth, burning to ash. Now, picture its emperor, not fighting the flames, but composing poetry as his people screamed. This is not just history. This is the chilling, unbelievable true story of Nero, Rome's most infamous ruler. A young man born to unimaginable power, who spiraled into a world of artistic obsession, depraved excess, and paranoia so deep, he turned on everyone he loved, and ultimately on Rome itself. Was he a monster, a genius, or a victim of his own terrifying ambition? From lavish parties and secret murders to the terrifying night the Great Fire consumed Rome, leaving chaos and suspicion in its wake. Prepare to discover the reign of the Mad Emperor. This is Nero, the Mad Emperor and the Great Fire of Rome, the epic, tragic, and utterly unforgettable story that changed Rome forever. In the gilded, yet treacherous, halls of ancient Rome's imperial palace, power was not simply inherited. It was a prize relentlessly pursued, cunningly manipulated, and all too often stained with blood. At the very heart of this relentless pursuit stood Agrippina the Younger, a woman of formidable lineage and even more formidable ambition. Her veins flowed with the very essence of Roman royalty. She was the daughter of the revered military hero Germanicus, sister to the infamous Emperor Caligula, and a direct descendant of the empire's founder, Augustus. From her earliest breath, Agrippina understood the brutal, unforgiving dance of power within the Julio-Claudian dynasty, a deadly waltz often choreographed with daggers, poison, and political maneuvering. Agrippina carried a burning purpose within her: to place her son, born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus in 37 AD, upon the imperial throne. This young boy was her ultimate pawn, her golden ticket to the absolute pinnacle of Roman society. His father, a man notorious for his cruelty and violence, had died when Lucius was a mere 3 years old. This early tragedy, rather than crippling Agrippina, sharpened her resolve. She dedicated every fiber of her being to securing her son's future, knowing that through his ascension, her own legacy would be forged in the annals of history. Her ambition was a cold, calculating fire that fueled her every decision. Agrippina's long-awaited opportunity arrived in 49 Agar. Through a meticulously woven web of political alliances, strategic marriages, and ruthless persuasion, she managed to secure a marriage to her uncle, the reigning Emperor Claudius. Claudius, an unlikely emperor himself, had been thrust into power after the assassination of Caligula. He was now an aging, somewhat frail ruler, known more for his scholarly pursuits and physical infirmities than for sharp political acumen. Agrippina, with her keen intellect and iron will, wasted no time in consolidating her position as empress, quickly becoming the dominant force behind Claudius. Her singular, unwavering goal was clear: to bypass Claudius's own natural-born son, Britannicus, and install her boy, Nero, as the heir to the Roman world. Her campaign to achieve this was a masterpiece of imperial manipulation. In 50 the relentless pressure and shrewd appeals, she successfully persuaded Claudius to formally adopt young Lucius. This act transformed the boy's destiny. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was officially rechristened Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Dramaticus, a name now echoing with the power and lineage of the imperial family itself. This adoption effectively placed him directly in line for the succession, overriding Britannicus's claim. To further bind Nero to the throne and prevent any future challenges, Agrippina orchestrated his betrothal to Claudius's own daughter, Octavia, making him his stepsister's husband. She also ensured that key positions within the formidable Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite personal protectors, were filled with men utterly loyal to her and her son, creating an unshakable base of military support. Nero, still a boy on the cusp of manhood, was now Rome's designated heir. His education was entrusted to the most brilliant mind available, Lucius Annaeus Seneca, the renowned Stoic philosopher, statesman, and playwright. Seneca, himself a victim of imperial intrigue, who had been exiled by Claudius and recalled by Agrippina, was tasked with the immense responsibility of molding the young prince. He immersed Nero in the principles of good governance, the art of rhetoric, and the beauty of classical arts. Seneca dreamed of cultivating a virtuous ruler, a true philosopher king, who would lead Rome into an age of enlightenment. For a brief, hopeful period, it truly seemed as though Rome had found its new beacon. A promising, cultured, golden boy, ready to usher in an era of peace and prosperity, far removed from the dark shadows of his dynasty's turbulent past. But the ruthless ambition that had engineered Nero's ascent would soon begin to consume its own architects. On October 13th, 54A, Emperor Claudius died under highly suspicious circumstances. The whispers of poison, widely attributed to Agrippina, spread quickly through the palace and the city. With the Praetorian Guard already secured by her loyalists, and the Roman Senate presented with a chilling fait accompli, the 16-year-old Nero, with his formidable mother standing imposingly by his side, was proclaimed the fifth Roman emperor. Agrippina's power seemed absolute. For a brief, intoxicating period, it appeared Rome had two rulers, the impressionable young emperor and the formidable, iron-willed woman who had so calculatingly placed him on the throne. The stage was now set for a tragic clash of wills, one that would define Nero's infamous reign. The ascension of a 16-year-old emperor in 54 AD might have sent shivers of uncertainty through Rome. After the erratic reign of Caligula and the convoluted, often arbitrary rule of Claudius, the city held its breath. Yet the initial 5 years of Nero's reign, a period historians would later call the Quinquennium Neronis, or the 5 years of Nero, proved to be a surprising, even brilliant, testament to effective governance. This was not the work of a boy king alone. Rome's new era was meticulously shaped by two formidable figures, Lucius Annaeus Seneca, Nero's former tutor and a titan of philosophy, and Sextus Afranius Burrus, the iron-willed and deeply respected prefect of the Praetorian Guard. Seneca, recalled from exile by the cunning Agrippina, was more than just an intellectual. He was a master of rhetoric, a prolific playwright, and a staunch adherent of Stoicism, a philosophy emphasizing virtue, reason, and self-control. He harbored an ambitious vision to sculpt Nero into the ideal ruler, a philosopher king who would lead with benevolence, justice, and intellectual enlightenment. Seneca became Nero's moral compass, guiding his speeches, advising on policy, and attempting to instill a sense of imperial responsibility. He saw in Nero a chance to put his lofty philosophical ideals into practice, to demonstrate that true power lay not in brute force, but in wisdom and moderation. Complementing Seneca's philosophical guidance was the pragmatic strength of Burrus, a seasoned military commander with an impeccable record and unwavering loyalty to the state. Burrus controlled the vast power of the Praetorian Guard. He ensured discipline, rooted out corruption, and crucially, protected the young emperor from both internal plots and external threats. While Seneca nurtured Nero's mind, Burrus secured his position, acting as a crucial bridge between the imperial household and the formidable Roman military machine. Together, Seneca and Burrus formed a powerful, if sometimes uneasy, alliance with Agrippina, working to present a united and stable front to the Senate and the Roman people. Under this triumvirate's calculated leadership, Rome experienced a period of remarkable reforms and a noticeable easing of the imperial burden. Nero, guided by Seneca's principles, publicly declared his commitment to ruling justly, promising to govern with compassion and to avoid the tyrannical excesses of his predecessors. He vowed to respect the Senate, a body often undermined by previous emperors. True to these initial promises, the early years saw tangible improvements for the Roman populace. Taxes were reduced, particularly for the poorer classes, alleviating significant economic strain. Laws were reviewed, clarified, and enforced more equitably, targeting corrupt provincial governors who had long exploited their positions. Public trials, which had sometimes descended into arbitrary political purges, were made more transparent, restoring a degree of faith in the justice system. Nero himself seemed, at first, eager to embody this enlightened image. He engaged in intellectual discussions, displaying a genuine and growing interest in the arts. He composed poetry, performed music, and even participated in chariot racing, talents which, though controversial among the more traditional Romans, delighted the common people. Seneca's influence was evident in Nero's early public appearances, where he delivered eloquent speeches filled with promises of a fair and just reign. The initial pronouncements to the Senate were deferential, promising to consult with them and to rule in accordance with the principles of Augustus, emphasizing peace and stability. Rome, still reeling from decades of imperial upheaval, breathed a collective sigh of relief. A new dawn, bathed in the glow of peace and prosperity, seemed to have arrived, ushered in by a young, cultured emperor guided by wise, experienced minds. It truly felt like a golden age was at hand. However, beneath this carefully cultivated veneer of stability and benevolence, deep and dangerous currents simmered. The meticulous architects of Nero's power, particularly Agrippina, were not content to simply fade into the background. Agrippina, the relentless force who had maneuvered her son onto the throne, refused to relinquish her formidable hold. She demanded to be present at Senate meetings, openly issued decrees, and rigidly controlled access to her son, subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, asserting her dominance. Her overbearing influence and her constant need to control grated on the young emperor. Nero, in his nascent years of power, began to chafe under her watchful eye. Resentful of the subtle manipulations she continued to employ to maintain her preeminent position. He was the emperor, yet he felt like a puppet. The initial conflicts were subtle, often played out in private confrontations, but they hinted at a growing schism. Nero yearned for independence, for unchecked authority, and for the freedom to indulge his artistic passions without his mother's critical gaze or political interference. Agrippina saw herself as the rightful co-ruler, the source of his power, and believed her experience gave her the right to dictate his every move. The promise of a golden age, while genuinely experienced by many Romans, was built on a dangerously unstable foundation of shifting loyalties, burgeoning resentment, and a young emperor's rapidly developing desire for absolute, unquestionable control. The initial calm that settled over Rome would not, and could not, last forever. The stage was now set for the first truly destructive conflict of Nero's reign, one that would shatter the image of the golden boy and reveal a far darker ambition. The harmony of the Golden Age, carefully orchestrated by Seneca and Boris, was a thin veneer, easily shattered by the clash of two titanic wills. While Nero was the crowned emperor, his mother, Agrippina the Younger, held the true reins of power. She had clawed her way to the pinnacle of influence, sacrificing everything, even her own virtue, to place her son on the throne. Now she demanded her due. Agrippina expected to rule through Nero, to be the undeniable power behind the purple. She attended Senate meetings, hidden behind a curtain, but her presence was a constant, unsettling reminder of who truly pulled the strings. She openly managed state affairs, dictated policy, and controlled who had access to her son, effectively making Nero a gilded puppet in his own palace. This suffocating control quickly became intolerable for Nero. At 16, he was a young man yearning for independence, for the unbridled freedom that came with absolute power. He yearned to indulge his passions for art, music, and chariot racing without his mother's watchful, disapproving, or manipulative gaze. He resented her constant meddling, her sharp criticisms of his choices, and her blatant attempts to undermine his authority in front of his advisors and the court. The adoration he once felt for her, or perhaps the fear that masqueraded as devotion, slowly curdled into a bitter, dangerous resentment. He was the emperor, yet he was still a boy under his mother's thumb. The tension escalated rapidly. The first open challenge came when Agrippina publicly berated Nero for his affair with a freedwoman named Acta. Agrippina saw Acta as a threat to her influence, a distraction from the imperial duties, and a challenge to her authority. Nero, however, saw Acta as a symbol of his newfound freedom and a genuine object of affection. He defied his mother openly, a small but significant act of rebellion. The imperial court, ever watchful, sensed the tectonic plates shifting beneath their feet. The power struggle between mother and son was no longer a private affair. It was spilling into public view. Agrippina, sensing her grip slipping, resorted to increasingly desperate and dangerous tactics. She began to flaunt her support for Britannicus, Claudius's natural son, whom Nero had displaced. She openly mourned Britannicus's diminished status and, according to some accounts, even threatened to expose Claudius's alleged will, which would have favored Britannicus as the true heir. This was an undeniable threat, a direct challenge to Nero's legitimacy and his very throne. Nero, in turn, began to view Britannicus not just as a potential rival, but as a weapon in his mother's hands. The stage was set for a chilling act of imperial cruelty. At a banquet in February 55 A, with Nero, Agrippina, and Britannicus present, Britannicus was served a drink that had been tampered with to appear harmless, but which secretly contained a deadly poison. The young man collapsed, convulsing, and died almost instantly. Nero feigned shock, attributing it to an epileptic fit, but the court knew better. The murder of Britannicus, just months into Nero's reign, sent a clear message. Nero would eliminate anyone who stood in his way, or anyone his mother might use against him. It was a cold, calculated act that hinted at the darkness simmering beneath the golden boy facade. With Britannicus eliminated, Agrippina's direct leverage dwindled, but her influence remained potent. She continued to criticize Nero's indulgence in art and music, his growing penchant for nocturnal escapades disguised as common citizens, and his increasing reliance on Seneca and Burrus, whom she now saw as rivals. Nero, desperate to rid himself of her suffocating presence, began to hatch a series of increasingly elaborate and horrifying plots to remove her permanently. His first attempt was cunningly devious. He commissioned a specially designed collapsible boat for Agrippina to use during a spring festival at Baia. The idea was that the boat would break apart at sea, making her death appear to be a tragic accident. The night of the planned accident was filled with tension. Agrippina boarded the vessel, seemingly unaware of the deadly treachery awaiting her. The boat indeed malfunctioned as planned, its roof collapsing, but Agrippina, a strong swimmer, managed to survive. She was rescued by passing fishing boats and swam ashore, battered but alive. She immediately sent a messenger to Nero, calmly informing him of her miraculous escape. Nero was reportedly horrified by her survival, terrified of her inevitable retribution. He knew he had to finish the job. Driven by a desperate fear and a growing madness, he sent a detachment of his Praetorian Guard to her villa. They stormed the residence, found Agrippina, and murdered her in cold blood. Her death was brutal and direct, a stark contrast to the subtle poisonings and engineered accidents typical of imperial intrigue. Accounts suggest she faced her killers with defiant courage, reportedly telling them to strike her womb, the source of her son. Her body was cremated that same night, her ashes scattered without formal ceremony. The murder of his mother was a pivotal, irreversible moment for Nero. It freed him from her suffocating grasp, but it also plunged him into a new kind of darkness. Though Seneca and Burrus publicly defended Nero's actions, claiming Agrippina had plotted against him, the deed sent shockwaves through Rome. The golden boy image shattered completely. The public was horrified, even if silently. Nero, now truly unchecked by any moral authority, began his descent into the tyranny and excess that would forever define his infamous reign. The shadow of his mother was gone, but in its place, a far more terrifying darkness began to grow within the emperor himself. With his mother, Agrippina, brutally removed from the scene, Nero believed he was finally free. The suffocating shadow that had loomed over his early reign was gone, replaced by a dangerous, intoxicating sense of absolute liberation. But this newfound freedom, unchecked by any moral compass or the political astuteness of his former advisers, would not lead to an era of enlightened rule. Instead, it marked the terrifying descent into decadence that would forever define his infamous legacy. The boy emperor, once seemingly guided by wisdom, began to shed his facade, revealing a chilling blend of artistic obsession, self-indulgence, and terrifying cruelty. The transformation was gradual at first, subtle shifts in his behavior that hinted at the darker impulses beneath. Seneca and Boris, still attempting to guide him, found their influence waning. Nero grew increasingly impatient with affairs of state, finding the tedious duties of governance dull compared to his burgeoning passions. His nocturnal escapades, once discreetly managed, became more brazen. He would roam the streets of Rome at night, disguised as a common citizen, often accompanied by his rowdy entourage. These outings frequently devolved into brawls, muggings, and even sexual assaults, with Nero himself participating in the violence, reveling in the anonymity and the sheer shock of his victims. He desired not just to observe common life, but to participate in its baser elements, a stark contrast to the dignified emperor he was supposed to be. Nero's artistic pretensions, once a charming eccentricity, now became a central, all-consuming obsession. He fancied himself a magnificent poet, a gifted musician, and an unparalleled charioteer. While he had genuine talent, his desire for public adoration verged on the pathological. He compelled Roman senators and noblemen, even the most distinguished, to attend his lengthy and often tedious performances. They were forced to sit for hours, applauding on cue, enduring his singing and lyre playing, even when their social standing made such displays utterly humiliating. To leave a performance early, or to show anything less than enthusiastic admiration, was to risk the emperor's wrath. Rome's elite, accustomed to commanding power, now found themselves prisoners in the imperial theater, their faces aching from forced smiles. His personal life, once carefully managed by Agrippina, exploded into a series of scandalous affairs and violent domestic upheavals. He became infatuated with Poppaea Sabina, a woman renowned for her beauty, wit, and immense ambition. Poppaea was already married, but that was a minor obstacle for an emperor. The real problem was Nero's loyal, dignified wife, Octavia, daughter of the late Emperor Claudius. Octavia was beloved by the Roman people, a symbol of stability and the legitimate Julio-Claudian line. She was blameless, modest, and completely loyal. Nero, however, wanted Poppaea, and Octavia stood in his way. He divorced Octavia on trumped-up charges of barrenness, then banished her. When public outrage erupted, he took the horrific step of having her murdered. Octavia was bound, her veins opened, and she eventually suffocated in a steam bath, her severed head then being presented to Poppaea. This brutal act, the murder of his innocent and popular wife, solidified Nero's transformation in the eyes of many. It demonstrated a chilling capacity for cruelty and a willingness to eliminate anyone who obstructed his desires, regardless of their innocence or public standing. The imperial court became a dangerous stage for sycophancy and fear. Those who flattered Nero's artistic endeavors were rewarded. Those who offered honest counsel, or worse, criticism, found themselves facing exile, confiscation of property, or death. Seneca himself, increasingly disillusioned and sidelined, tried to maintain some moral influence, but Nero's trust had eroded. Burrus, the Praetorian prefect, who had provided a crucial military counterbalance, died in 62 AD under suspicious circumstances widely believed to be poisoning. With Burrus gone, Tigellinus, a far more ruthless and amoral figure, rose to prominence in the Praetorian Guard, encouraging Nero's worst impulses. Nero's escalating tyranny manifested in increasingly arbitrary executions. Wealthy citizens were often targeted, their vast fortunes confiscated to fund the emperor's extravagant lifestyle and ambitious building projects. The line between reasoned justice and imperial whim blurred, then vanished. His grand artistic tours across Greece, where he competed in games and received staged adoration, further drained the imperial treasury and alienated the conservative Roman elite. They viewed his public performances as utterly undignified and shameful for a Roman emperor. As Nero indulged in his increasingly bizarre artistic fantasies and spiraled into depravity, discontent simmered across the empire. The Senate, once cautiously respected, was now openly scorned. The people, initially charmed, grew uneasy with his excesses and the increasing brutality of his rule. The financial strain of his lavish spending began to weigh heavily on the provinces. The emperor who had once promised a golden age was now seen by many as a dangerous madman, detached from the realities of governance and utterly consumed by his own ego and appetites. The stage was set for the next cataclysm, a moment that would etch his name into history with a terrifying, fiery intensity. Rome, the undisputed heart of the ancient world, was a city of unparalleled grandeur. Yet, beneath its magnificent temples, sprawling forums, and luxurious villas, lay a sprawling, chaotic metropolis ripe for disaster. Its narrow, winding streets were choked with wooden shops and towering multi-story apartment buildings. The insulae, often shoddily constructed and packed tightly together. Cooking fires burned constantly within these structures, and oil lamps flickered precariously. The summer of 64 AD was particularly hot and dry, turning the city into a vast tinderbox, just waiting for a spark. That spark ignited on the night of July 1964 A. The precise origin remains shrouded in mystery, but the flames erupted in the shops around the Circus Maximus, Rome's massive chariot racing arena. Fueled by highly flammable materials like oil, pitch, and wood, and fanned by a strong, persistent wind, the fire immediately roared out of control. It tore through the circus stalls, then leapt across the stadium itself, engulfing the densely packed residential areas on the slopes of the Palatine and Celian hills. The speed and ferocity of its spread were terrifying. Panic immediately erupted. The sounds of joy and revelry from the city's lively streets swiftly turned into screams of terror and frantic shouts. Thousands of citizens, jolted from their sleep, spilled out into the choking, smoke-filled night. Mothers clutched their children, old men stumbled through the chaos, and families desperately tried to salvage what little they could from their burning homes. The narrow streets, already congested, became impassable death traps, blocked by fleeing crowds, collapsing buildings, and falling debris. People were trampled in the stampede, suffocated by smoke, or trapped by the relentless advance of the inferno. The sky, once illuminated by the gentle glow of moonlight, now pulsed with an ominous, hellish orange and red. The fire raged for 6 days and 7 nights without interruption. It consumed everything in its path, swallowing entire districts whole. The Forum Boreum, the Valabrum, and the slopes of the Capitoline, Palatine, and Esquiline hills became a terrifying landscape of smoke and ash. Temples, monuments, and the cherished homes of both the rich and the poor crumbled into ruin. The heat was so intense it warped stone and melted metal. Roman officials, initially stunned, struggled to organize any coherent firefighting efforts. Their antiquated methods, reliant on bucket brigades and demolition teams, were utterly overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the conflagration. The inferno seemed to possess a life of its own, an unstoppable, devouring beast. While Rome burned, the Emperor Nero was reportedly at his villa in Antium, some 30 miles away on the coast. He rushed back to the city upon hearing the news, witnessing the horror firsthand from the gardens of Maecenas. He immediately set about organizing relief efforts, opening his own gardens and public buildings to provide shelter for the homeless. He ordered grain supplies rushed in and sold at drastically reduced prices, trying to alleviate the suffering of the displaced masses. He genuinely seemed to be working to mitigate the disaster, at least initially. Yet despite his efforts, a chilling and enduring rumor began to spread like wildfire through the traumatized city, that Nero himself had ordered the blaze, or at least had enjoyed its spectacle. The most famous, and almost certainly apocryphal, tale alleged that Nero, dressed in theatrical costume, ascended to a tower on the Palatine hill and played his lyre, singing mournfully of the sack of Troy as his own city burned. This image of the artist-emperor calmly performing while Rome perished quickly became ingrained in popular legend, fueled by the widespread resentment towards his artistic pretensions and his increasing tyranny. The rumor gained traction because of Nero's well-known desire to rebuild Rome on a grander scale, to create his vision of a new Rome, and his subsequent construction of the lavish Domus Aurea on land cleared by the fire. People whispered that he had burned the old city to make way for his golden palace. When the inferno finally subsided, the devastation was staggering. Of Rome's 14 districts, only 4 remained completely untouched. 3 were utterly razed to the ground, and 7 others were severely damaged. Tens of thousands were left homeless, their lives shattered, their livelihoods destroyed. The air was thick with the stench of smoke, burnt wood, and death. The once bustling streets were now desolate landscapes of smoldering ruins and charred debris. The human cost was immeasurable, the physical damage catastrophic. The Great Fire of Rome was not merely a disaster. It was a profound trauma that would reshape the city and, in its aftermath, forever alter the course of Nero's reign, leading him to desperate measures to deflect the growing suspicion and anger of his tormented people. The embers of the city would soon ignite a new kind of fire, a relentless persecution. The ashes of Rome were barely cool, but a new chilling fire had already begun to spread, the fire of suspicion. The sheer scale of the devastation was incomprehensible, and the Roman people, traumatized and homeless, desperately sought an explanation. Their eyes, still stinging from smoke, quickly turned to the Emperor Nero. Despite his visible efforts at relief, the long-standing rumors of his artistic self-absorption, his desire for a new Rome, and his increasingly tyrannical nature now converged into a single, terrifying accusation. Nero had orchestrated the Great Fire. The whispers grew into murmurs, then into angry shouts. The populace, stripped of their homes and livelihoods, began to openly voice their fury. How could the emperor be so detached, so extravagant, while their lives lay in ruins? The story of him playing his lyre as the city burned, whether true or not, hardened into a terrifying truth in the public mind. Nero, acutely aware of the mounting hatred and the very real threat to his throne, knew he had to act. He needed a scapegoat, someone to absorb the collective trauma and fury of the Roman people. His gaze fell upon a small, often misunderstood, and largely persecuted sect, the Christians. Christianity was a relatively new religion in Rome, its followers often viewed with suspicion. They worshipped a single, unseen God, refused to participate in Roman state cults or emperor worship, and gathered in secret, fueling rumors of strange rituals and antisocial behavior. Their numbers were small, their influence negligible, and they had few powerful allies within the Roman elite. They were, in Nero's cold calculation, the perfect target. The persecution that followed was horrific and brutal, designed to be a public spectacle that would both punish the guilty and terrorize anyone else who dared to question the emperor. Nero accused the Christians of arson, fabricating evidence and extracting confessions through torture. The methods of execution were designed for maximum cruelty and public impact. Many Christians were sewn into animal skins and thrown to wild dogs in the arenas, torn apart for the amusement of the crowds. Others were crucified, left to die a slow, agonizing death. Perhaps most infamously, some were used as human torches to illuminate Nero's own gardens at night. Coated in pitch or other flammable materials, they were set ablaze, their burning bodies providing a macabre light for the emperor's lavish evening entertainment. Nero himself, according to the historian Tacitus, would sometimes drive his chariot among the victims, seemingly reveling in the gruesome spectacle. This extreme cruelty, rather than completely diverting blame from Nero, served to solidify his image as a tyrant in the minds of many, even those who felt no sympathy for the Christians. The persecution served its immediate purpose for Nero. It provided a tangible enemy for the Roman people to focus their wrath upon, a convenient explanation for the inexplicable devastation of their city. For a time, it eased the pressure on the emperor. Yet, in the long term, it would have profound and unintended consequences. The resilience and unwavering faith of the Christians in the face of such unimaginable suffering inadvertently elevated their status and spread their message. The very cruelty of their persecution began to generate sympathy, even among non-Christians, laying the groundwork for the future growth of a religion that would one day transform the very empire that sought to extinguish it. Nero had seemingly survived the immediate crisis of the Great Fire, but at a terrible moral cost. His actions had stained his reign with unprecedented cruelty, irrevocably associating his name with mass persecution and the destruction of his own city. The seeds of his ultimate downfall were now firmly sown, watered by the blood of the innocent and fanned by the lingering smoke of Rome. The great fire of Rome had left vast swaths of the city in smoldering ruin. Hundreds of thousands of citizens were homeless, living in makeshift shelters, their lives shattered. The immediate aftermath demanded a massive effort of reconstruction, focused on housing, infrastructure, and public services. Yet Emperor Nero, displaying a shocking disregard for the suffering of his people, and an almost unfathomable egomania, saw the devastation not as a tragedy, but as an unprecedented opportunity. He envisioned a new Rome, a city built to his own specifications, with himself at its glorious center. And at the heart of this new vision was his most audacious, most infamous project, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. This was no mere imperial residence. The Domus Aurea was a sprawling, unprecedented complex that defied the very definition of a palace. It was built upon land cleared by the devastating fire, encompassing areas on the Palatine, Esquiline, and Cælian hills. It was a true golden city within the city, an architectural marvel of obscene luxury. The palace boasted over 200 rooms, adorned with marble imported from across the empire, dazzling frescoes, and ceilings encrusted with precious stones and ivory. Gold, true to its name, was everywhere. Walls shone with it, reflecting light in every direction. Beyond the sheer opulence of its materials, the Domus Aurea was a marvel of engineering and extravagant design. One of its most fabled features was a circular dining room with a constantly revolving ceiling, mimicking the movement of the heavens, complete with concealed pipes that showered guests with perfumes and flower petals. Hidden mechanisms provided a constant flow of water for elaborate fountains, and artificial lakes were dug where entire naval battles could be staged. The complex included vast, landscaped parks filled with vineyards, pastures for grazing animals, and even a sprawling artificial lake that once stood where the Colosseum would later be built. A colossal, 120-foot bronze statue of Nero himself, the Colossus Neronis, stood at the entrance, depicting him as the sun god's soul, dwarfing all who approached. It was a monument to megalomania. The sheer scale and cost of this private wonderland ignited furious public outrage. Rome desperately needed housing, food, and stability. Instead, their emperor was spending unimaginable sums on a personal pleasure dome. Every ounce of gold, every precious stone, every highly skilled artisan employed on the Domus Aurea was seen as a direct affront to the suffering populace. The whispers, which had accused Nero of starting the fire, now solidified into chilling certainty in the minds of many. Why else would he need so much prime real estate, so abruptly cleared, if not to build this monstrous palace? The suspicion that he had intentionally torched Rome to make way for his golden house became a widely held belief, a dark stain that would forever cling to his name. Funding this colossal indulgence required immense resources. The imperial treasury, already strained by Nero's previous extravagances, was rapidly depleted. To finance the Domus Aurea, Nero resorted to increasingly brutal and desperate measures. Taxes were raised to crippling levels across the empire, squeezing every ounce of wealth from the provinces. Temples, both in Rome and abroad, were systematically plundered, their sacred gold and silver melted down to adorn Nero's palace. Statues of gods and emperors, cherished works of art, were stripped of their precious metals. Wealthy Roman citizens, particularly those with vast estates or valuable art collections, became prime targets. Often, trumped-up charges of treason or conspiracy were leveled against them, leading to their execution and the immediate confiscation of their fortunes. Fear permeated the upper echelons of Roman society. No one was safe if Nero coveted their wealth or their land. The construction of the Domus Aurea was not just an act of architectural ambition. It was a tangible symbol of Nero's complete detachment from reality, his tyrannical disregard for the well-being of his subjects, and his escalating madness. It stood as a colossal monument to his ego, rising from the ashes of a devastated city, a glaring and permanent reminder of the emperor's perceived culpability in Rome's destruction. The golden walls of his new palace became a gilded prison for the spirit of the Roman people, fueling a deep simmering resentment that would eventually erupt into open rebellion. The foundation of the Domus Aurea was laid with mortar and stone, but its true bedrock was public anger and a growing desire for vengeance against the emperor who had so brazenly defied both gods and men. Nero's reign, once heralded by the illusion of a golden age, had now fully devolved into a spiral of tyranny and terror. His mother was dead, his popular wife brutally murdered, and the city of Rome lay partially rebuilt, but fundamentally scarred, with his monstrous golden house rising from its ashes. The Roman elite, particularly the senators and wealthy equestrians, watched with growing alarm and quiet fury. They endured his compulsory musical performances, his undignified appearances in the arena, and his increasingly arbitrary executions. The emperor's behavior was not merely embarrassing. It was a grave threat to their lives, their wealth, and the very foundations of the Roman state. The resentment simmered for years, quietly fostering in the shadows of elegant villas and hushed conversations. until it erupted in 65 AD in the form of the Pisonian conspiracy. This was a vast and complex plot, drawing together a diverse array of individuals from all levels of Roman society. Senators, equestrians, military officers, and even members of Nero's own court joined forces. Their chosen leader was Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a charismatic and well-connected senator. The conspirators, fed up with Nero's despotism and deeply fearful for Rome's future, planned to assassinate the emperor and replace him with Piso. Among the key figures involved were none other than Seneca, Nero's former tutor, and Lucan, the famous poet and Seneca's nephew. Though Seneca's involvement remains debated by historians, Nero certainly believed he was part of it. The plot was elaborate, aiming to strike Nero during the annual games of Ceres, or at his villa in Antium. However, like many conspiracies, it was ultimately betrayed. One of the conspirators, a former freedman named Epaphroditus, revealed details of the plot to Nero. Nero's reaction was swift, merciless, and utterly paranoid. A wave of arrests and executions swept through Rome, plunging the city into a new reign of terror. Nero, with the loyal but ruthless Praetorian prefect Tigellinus by his side, oversaw the brutal interrogations personally. Confessions, whether true or coerced through torture, led to a cascade of denunciations. No one was safe. Many prominent Romans were accused, some genuinely involved, many others simply victims of suspicion or personal vendettas. The most poignant executions involved figures who had once been close to Nero. Seneca, despite his long service and efforts to guide Nero, was implicated. Nero ordered him to commit suicide. Seneca faced his death with stoic dignity, his final moments spent offering comfort and wisdom to his friends and wife. A tragic end for the man who had once tried to shape a philosopher king. Lucan, the brilliant poet, also received the same grim order. He too ended his life, allegedly reciting lines from his own epic poem about the Roman civil war as his veins were opened. Numerous other senators, military commanders, and intellectuals were forced to take their own lives or were publicly executed, their vast properties confiscated by the emperor. The Pisonian conspiracy, though failed, allowed Nero to eliminate many potential threats and enrich his depleted treasury. Yet even as Nero purged the elite of Rome, the seeds of rebellion were already sprouting in the distant provinces. The financial strain of his extravagant projects, particularly the Domus Aurea, had pushed the empire to its breaking point. In 66 AD, a major Jewish revolt erupted in Judea, a difficult and costly war for Rome. Then, in 68 A, the formidable governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, Gaius Julius Vindex, launched an open rebellion, openly declaring Nero a tyrant and calling for a new emperor. Vindex's rebellion, though eventually crushed by other Roman legions, was a fatal blow. It signaled to the Roman world that Nero's hold on power was weakening, that he could be challenged. The dominoes began to fall rapidly. Servius Sulpicius Galba, the elderly and respected governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, initially hesitant, declared his allegiance to Vindex and joined the revolt. The Praetorian prefect Nymphidius Sabinus, seeing the writing on the wall, abandoned Nero and declared his support for Galba, promising handsome donatives to the Praetorian Guard. Nero's last loyal supporters began to desert him. The legions in Germany and the East, once bulwarks of imperial power, declared their support for Galba. The Senate, sensing the imminent collapse of Nero's power, also turned against him, declaring him a public enemy. Nero, utterly detached from reality, seemed incapable of grasping the gravity of his situation. He oscillated between delusional plans for theatrical performances and desperate schemes to escape. He reportedly considered fleeing to Egypt, or even staging a dramatic public plea for forgiveness. But his options were dwindling to nothing. His palace guards abandoned him, his closest freedmen fled, and even his few remaining loyal slaves urged him to seek refuge. The very power he had so ruthlessly seized was now dissolving around him. The empire had finally had enough. Very power he had so ruthlessly seized was now dissolving around him. The empire had finally had enough. The vast, intricate machinery of the Roman Empire, once firmly under Nero's thumb, was now grinding to a halt, turning against him. The revolts, which had begun in distant provinces, had finally reached the very gates of Rome. His armies, his senate, and even his once loyal Praetorian Guard had abandoned him, swayed by the promise of financial rewards from the advancing General Galba. Nero, isolated and utterly delusional, seemed incapable of grasping the catastrophic reality of his situation. His once impenetrable golden house, a monument to his ego, had become a gilded cage, soon to be stormed by his own former subjects. On the night of June 8th, 68A, the facade of imperial power crumbled completely. The Praetorian Guard, swayed by the lavish promises of Galba's agents, mutinied. They had pledged their loyalty to a new emperor. News reached Nero in his palace that he was no longer safe, that his guards were preparing to seize him. His few remaining loyal servants, those who had not yet fled, urged him to escape. The silence of the vast Domus Aurea, once filled with music and laughter, was now heavy with the weight of impending doom. He tried to summon his personal guards, but none came. He sent messages to his friends, hoping for a final gesture of loyalty, but received no replies. He was truly terrifyingly alone. Driven by a paralyzing fear, Nero attempted a desperate escape. He planned to flee to Ostia, take a ship, and perhaps reach Egypt, where he believed he might find refuge and a new audience for his artistic talents. Gathering a handful of his most trusted freedmen and a few remaining slaves, he slipped out of the sprawling palace under the cover of darkness. They rode on horseback, disguised and terrified, along deserted roads. As they rode, the ground beneath them trembled with the approaching sounds of the Praetorian Guard. He allegedly muttered lines of poetry, a macabre habit even in his final moments, contemplating his fate. Their destination was a small villa belonging to his freedman Fine, a few miles outside the city walls. The journey was fraught with terror. The horses shied at the lightning that tore across the night sky. The cries of distant soldiers could be heard. As they dismounted and approached the villa on foot, Through a reed-filled thicket Nero's face was scratched by thorns, and he reportedly scooped water from a muddy ditch to drink, a stark contrast to the pampered emperor who lived in opulent luxury. He overheard guards discussing his imminent capture and the brutal fate that awaited him. The reality of his downfall, sudden and absolute, finally began to sink in. Inside Fine's humble villa, the once all-powerful emperor was reduced to a desperate, hunted man. He refused to commit suicide, a dignified death for a Romang, lacking the courage to take his own life. He paced nervously, demanding that a shallow grave be dug for him, constantly urging his companions to set an example and kill themselves first. He even tried to compose a lament for his own death, his theatricality clinging to him until the very end. The sounds of approaching cavalry, sent to capture him alive for public execution, grew louder. He could hear their horses thundering closer, the jingle of their armor, the shouts of the centurions. Finally, spurred by his freedmen and the imminent arrival of his captors, Nero knew there was no escape. With a trembling hand, guided by his secretary Epaphroditus, he plunged a dagger into his throat. His last words, famously recounted by Suetonius, were qualis artifex perio, meaning what an artist dies in me, or what an artist the world loses in me. With a final gasp, Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the fifth Roman emperor, perished. He was not yet 31 years old. His death on June 9, 68 marked the dramatic end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The lineage of emperors descended from Augustus himself. With Nero gone, Rome plunged into a period of unprecedented chaos, known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian would all seize and lose the throne in rapid succession, a brutal testament to the power vacuum left by Nero's tyrannical, yet ultimately weak, rule. The empire, shattered by fire and tyranny, now faced a civil war that would test its very endurance. Nero's legacy would forever be one of excess, cruelty, and the dramatic, self-inflicted end of an imperial line. The city he tried to rebuild in gold, and ultimately destroyed with fire, was finally free of its mad emperor.